And so, Scott, as you are active in some voting initiatives there in Atlanta and have been active in that capacity, where do you think the limits are as we've gone up against opposition in that standpoint as well, especially in the state of Georgia where voters are removed from rolls? Voters have to deal with, honestly, straight up discrimination. We've seen gerrymandering. We've seen deliberate attempts to boost the power profile of white voters while diminishing that of black and brown voters. We saw activity of that from the RNC that eventually led to a Supreme Court decision. So how does one get involved in those actions at the local level, the state level, with regards to voting? And what things can we do to open up the access while we work against all the opposition to it?
Yeah, well, I started at a level that was national, and people that I got to know. Again, because of this job and this platform in the NFL, you have proximity to power and proximity to people of influence. So I started educating myself, and people led me in the right direction. People led me to other people. You mentioned we just went through this in Georgia. We went through it a couple of years ago with the governor's race and Stacey Abrams and communities at large being marginalized and not being able to vote. And I was unfortunately, whether what just happened in our most recent primary election, whether it was incompetence or whether it was intentional, something went wrong, and something is still going very wrong. You've got certain communities where, I live in the city in Midtown, and watching what was happening when people were trying to vote there versus some of the other suburban communities or areas like Buckhead where there weren't lines and areas where there were lines. And then you have people being purged from from being able to vote from the role. And it's once again, people in power have the ability to create rules, change rules. And unfortunately, what's happening is the people that are getting into power, we are not holding them accountable because they're getting rid of people and they're changing rules as they go along that that are going to benefit them primarily. And we're not holding those people accountable that need to do the right thing, and they're just simply not doing the right thing. We go back to the history. One of the things I've talked about most recently was I had a meeting with the secretaries of state across the country in a phone call, and what I don't understand is we have all of these spaces that can be used in this country and we're not using them. They're taxpayer created buildings and facilities, yet we still have people trying to go vote in the basements of churches and the basements of buildings throughout cities across America. And we've got these facilities to use and we don't use them. There's so many different ways that we can be empowering or just getting the vote done and getting people to find better ways. This is a silly thing, and I'm not educated enough on the vote. This is happening as I go. We've had this thing that we call Election Day. Well, we created Election Day when there were millions and millions, tens of millions of fewer people now that have to vote. So now we're in this space and we're still using only one day to vote. We're intentionally finding ways to not allow people to vote. And we've got to fix that because it's a right that's available for every citizen in this country, and they're not getting that opportunity.
Dr. Rice, to steer things back to backlash and the way that we perceive that, it seems as though these discussions throughout the years, going back to, as you said, the civil rights movement never really ended. But going back to years previous to that, there was this idea that backlash was coming, and it was as sure as the tides coming in or the sun rising and setting. And they acknowledged the fact that backlash was coming, but they also gave it power. It was used as an excuse to not do things because of this impending backlash from the communities that have the power that have instituted these things. So how do we acknowledge that backlash exists, that people who are being relatively quiet now are going to get increasingly loud as we get closer to November? How do we acknowledge it, but without giving it power?
I think just by giving voice to it. So that backlash exists. That there's going to be pushback because you're pushing against a power. You're pushing against the institutionalization of one culture as being better than another. So you understand that, but you do what's right. And I think that's really, I don't want to be warm and fuzzy here, but we really want to do what's right. Um, I have conversations with a lot of folks. We're really talking about, and this might be Scott that I had a conversation with before, where we're really looking at how it is human beings are learning how to be better human beings to one another. And again, I don't want to be all warm and fuzzy and suggest that race and ethnicity and gender and sexual expression and all those kinds of things don't play. But at the end of the day, we are all human beings. We know that race is a faux construct biologically, all right? Biopsychologically, it's very real because we give it power in terms of how it is that we respond to people who have a wide nose or thick lips or springy hair. So we know those things, but it's such a fiction. So how is it that we really do what's right by our brethren and by our sisters? How is it that we do the right thing and make sure that all people are able to walk on this earth unencumbered and not have to deal with and wrestle with the violence that's tethered to racism and white supremacy?
Well said, Dr. Rice. In terms of the lie, I guess, of biological race, something that kind of permeates our society, right? You go back, and it's a lie that would have you believe that rape was consensual for millions of slaves across the United States. A lie that would have you believe that there was only one segment of the global community that contributed to science, art, or technology over the course of this entire human experience, right? And so, Justin, when we evaluate, I guess, the way that lie is used to demean, subjugate, and harm people, and we try to think of ways to use policy to fix that. If I'm giving you, right, if you're the benevolent dictator, and you can pick a starting point in order to fix this, where does one even begin when you talk about 400 plus years of systemic oppression?
Yeah, wow. That's a huge question.
It's a lot,
right? And
it's a lot.
I think it's starting though, right? It's starting. When you get a lot of white folks to come out and support Black Lives Matter, which 4 or 5 years ago was seen as untouchable unless you were a Black person or someone who was really kind of already in it. It was kind of seen as untouchable. Now we have Black Lives Matter being painted everywhere, being talked about everywhere. That's a start, right? And it's so hard, like I said earlier, to fix all of it so fast because it is so systemic. It really is like was said earlier, the original sin of this country, right? But that doesn't mean it can't be fixed. And so I think it starts with, like we said earlier, holding ourselves accountable, holding the people around us accountable, and being comfortable having uncomfortable conversations, right? That's something that I think is learned. I think that's something that we all have to learn to do. But I also think it comes with holding people in power accountable, whether it doesn't matter what race they are, right? It doesn't matter if you have a Black president, a Black mayor, right? You need to hold those people accountable because just because they're Black and in office does not mean they're actually advocating for Black issues, right? We need diversity of thought, right? As well as diversity of, ethnicity or whatever in those houses of power. So I think that's a place to start, right? I think just because you might vote Democrat doesn't mean you aren't pulling whoever the nominee for that party to your position. And you were saying backlash earlier, right? I think a lot of times it's easy for Democrats to be like, oh, we won't support Medicare for all. We won't support public college for everyone because they're going to say you're a communist, you're a socialist. Well, guess what? Barack Obama passed the Affordable Care Act, which forced you to buy health insurance from a private company, and they called that communist. So they're going to call whatever you do socialist, communist, whatever. So you might as well do the right thing. Do the thing that's going to help the working man. Do the thing that's going to help the person who's struggling paycheck to paycheck and is working 2 or 3 jobs, trying to make sure they can pay off, they can keep the lights on, pay the bills, and send their kid to college. How about we do something to help those people? Because for way too long, those people have been left out. And everyone sees that now. Everyone saw the lines in Kentucky of a bunch of white folks trying to get food in a bread line while we're bailing out corporations, right? So everyone sees this now. Yes, Black people and brown people have it worse, but there are a lot of poor white folks out there too who are being told things to make them hate someone else, instead of actually going against who they should be going against, which is the person, the capitalist that gave that immigrant the job over them. So I think we need to refocus our attention to where we need to go as a people, as a society. I know we often live in a bubble here in America, but guess what? Just north of Detroit, where my dad grew up, they have universal health care. It don't matter if you're born poor or rich. If you get sick, you can go to the doctor and get treated, and it costs less. So we have to stop thinking that just because we do something here, it's the best, right? We can take stuff from other places with all the resources we have and institute those policies, institute what they're doing to make it better for us. But it's going to take a mass people, because guess what? The power is very concentrated with a small group of people. And until we can all come together and stop pointing the finger at this other person and saying, you know, they're the problem, even though guess what? Y'all are in the same situation. Both y'all can't really pay your bills because you're not getting paid a living wage. So I think we have to refocus our attention to the real issues and the real people who have power, and hold them accountable. And not just say, oh, I'm a Republican, oh, I'm a Democrat, so whatever, I'm just going to vote for that nominee. No, how about you hold that person accountable and make sure they're trying to do something to help you in your life? And I think that's something that's missing in our society. And I'm hoping that with this movement that can become, you know, something that's more apparent to a lot of people.